Many of the routes that I take my hikes on are former travelways. Sometimes they're old portage routes, sometimes they're informal routes to beaches and communities. Sometimes they're the paths that Indigenous communities took for hundreds of years. And sometimes they're old roads. And many of those roads are legally still highways. Well, on today's Walkabout, I'm going to be visiting a number of abandoned roads that are still legally public highways. I've traveled along many roads in past episodes, of course, which would be considered abandoned. Parts of the old coach road near Halifax is legally a public highway. The Roxbury Road, which took me to a ghost town in season 1 of Walkabout, is also still legally a road, and is in fact still used by many hunters to access cabins, though they do it in old vehicles that can take a beating. They may be legally highways, but they are not the multi-lane highways we think of today. Well, to start with, it's important to understand how the government defines a highway. The law says a public highway is any highway or public road, including bridges. Yes, only the government would define highway by using the word highway. Nonetheless, right now, I'm on the edge of the Harvest Highway, which is Highway 101 through the Annapolis Valley in Nova Scotia. And where I'm walking is the Canaan Mountain Road, or at least the abandoned portion of it. But though abandoned, it's still legally a public highway. This orphan portion of road was the tail end of the still maintained Canaan Mountain Road, and it continued across to where Canaan Avenue is now on the other side of Highway 101. The construction of that 100 series highway in 1962 bisected this road, and the 450-meter section nearing the highway of today was gradually abandoned. And that's what happens. Public roads become abandoned and unused over time, but they remain public rights of way. Sometimes they're used for travel to camps or old homesteads, but they receive no maintenance. All public roads owned by the province are classed with letters. A and B roads are basically 100 series highways. C and D roads are minor highways. E and F class roads, collector highways like trunk routes and highways with the names Route 1. Then you get into the local classifications like G, H, I, and J. These basically go from being busier paved local roads down to gravel low-volume routes. Then there are the abandoned roads, which the province no longer maintains, but still considers highways. The province classifies them as something called K-class roads. And that's what this road and all the roads I'll be traveling on today are. This is where another Provincial Highways Act definition becomes important: the word maintenance. The Public Highways Act in Nova Scotia defines maintenance as the preservation and keeping in repair of a public highway, and it includes the removal of snow and supplying of any materials connected to it. Now, if you live on a highway or a road that is cratered with potholes, you may feel like your road has been abandoned. But this is truly an abandoned road. It does not receive maintenance. You cannot call the Department of Transportation and ask for them to maintain the road. However, this is legally as much a road and as much a public road as Spring Garden Road is in downtown Halifax. Now, that has led to conflicts at times because these roads often bisect private property. And that creates its own challenges. The reality is, in many trail networks, including ones on old rail lines, sometimes there is conflict. Hiking routes along abandoned yet still legal roads are really no different. They can become dumping areas, and sometimes private property owners feel they own the land. Even this spot has had its disputes now and again, with some not fully understanding it remains a public right-of-way. Education is important, but also, as a hiker, respecting the route and neighboring properties, whether you are on a rail trail, a government trail, or an abandoned road corridor, goes a long way to keeping these spaces open for all. Well, with a bit of an understanding of what an abandoned road is, it's worth thinking about Canaan itself and where that came from. Of course, this road used to go from Highbury, basically where I am now, to Kentville. When the Harvest Highway, or Highway 101, was built, the new Canaan Road was constructed, and that crosses to Kentville at exit 12. This road actually still appears on Google Maps, despite the fact that it doesn't go anywhere. Situated on South Mountain, the community of Canaan is rooted in forestry and farming. Some scholars suggest the word Canaan originates from texts going back to the ancient Greeks. There was at one time a country called Canaan in what is now Lebanon, a country which was also known as Phoenicia. In the Hurrian language, Canaan comes from the word purple, and the Greeks called the Canaanites Phoenicians, which is the Greek word for purple. The Phoenicians worked with purple dye, thus attracting the moniker, the Purple People. The name Canaan would reappear long after the Greeks in the Bible's book of Genesis, where Noah's grandson is named Canaan. It's believed the name here in Kings County is taken from the Bible, regardless of where the name originates. The name is also not as unusual as you might think. In Nova Scotia alone, there is a Canaan in Lunenburg County, a New Canaan in Cumberland County, and a South Canaan in Yarmouth County. Well, this stretch of abandoned road is quite pretty, but admittedly it's also very short. It does give you a good explanation of why these roads sometimes become abandoned, in this case because it was bisected by a new highway. Well, after the break, I'm going to be headed to yet another abandoned road in the valley, one that hides an almost abandoned story of a gruesome murder. Sometimes abandoned roads are home to abandoned stories. That's no different than here at the Lightfoot Road in Burlington, which was the site of a grisly murder and resulted in the last public hanging in Kings County. Now, for a long time, locals in this area wanted that story forgotten. They didn't want to be associated with it. That is until 2014, when a monument was built at a local cemetery to recognize victims of domestic violence. To this day, it's one of the most notorious crimes in Kings County history. At an unassuming farm on North Mountain on May 24th, 1904, Teresa and William Robinson had a terrible argument. William was Teresa's second husband. They'd only been married a year and a half, but had been known to have a violent relationship. The next morning, the house was found burned. Teresa's dismembered body was found in the rubble of the house with a crushed skull. Some of her limbs were missing. A bloody axe was nearby. William was missing. The community formed a lynch mob, and they came down this very road in search of William. But by that point, William had caught wind of it, and he turned himself in. He was sent to trial, but he did not escape a hanging. He declared his innocence to the very end. Now at the hanging, community members, completely full of alcohol by this point, went up to the gallows after his death and cut him down, taking parts of the rope home as souvenirs. The hanging in Kentville was so disturbing in its aftermath, all subsequent hangings were held at the penitentiary in Halifax. To this day, people say ghosts haunt this area. Teresa's limbs were never found, and it's rumored they were dumped in the Brown Brook Ravine, which runs behind the lands where the farmhouse once sat. The river is a trout fishing location, but people don't stay after dark because arms and legs are said to come out of the water. So I'm searching for the homestead, or the location of the homestead of the Robinsons where that murder happened. And people actually say that there are ghosts in this area as a result of that murder. And what do I find on the ground in the forest but ghost pipe? It's here that Teresa Robinson was brutally murdered. All that remains now in the forest just off the road are the remains of the foundations of the different buildings that would have been on the homestead. And along the road, along the Lightfoot Road, the wall that people would have seen as they passed. The home was never rebuilt after it burned down that night, and eventually the property was willed to the Nova Scotia Nature Trust to be protected as conservation land forever, and so it would never again be a home. Some of Teresa Robinson's remains are buried in the Burlington Cemetery, which is about 4 kilometers from here. Her grave is unmarked, though it's believed to be close to her sister, Charlotte. A monument was erected there in 2014 to remember her and to stand for all women subject to domestic violence. Well, this is Gould Road, which is yet another abandoned provincial road, but still officially a public highway. If you follow this road, you'll reach Barley Street, which will take you to the Burlington Cemetery. Also buried in that cemetery is Bertha Beckwith, another woman with a connection to this road, but one with a happier story. The New York Times wrote, "Miss Bertha Delight Beckwith, a talented Nova Scotia girl, is making a name for herself here in New York City." She died at 91 in New York City, but is buried in Burlington Cemetery. Odds are, despite her many accomplishments, she is a famous Nova Scotia woman you've never heard of. So to understand Bertha's connection to this road, you first need to know a little bit about this road itself. You've heard me refer to it as the Lightfoot Road, and around here many locals will still refer to it as the Lightfoot Road, but officially, for a while now, it's been known as the Nolet-Beckwith Road. And Nolet Beckwith was Bertha's brother. Nolet Beckwith was born in this area on November 18th, 1876, and he lived here for his entire life, fishing and farming. This is largely the reason why the name changed from Lightfoot Road, as it had been known since the 1800s, to Nolet Beckwith Road. But while Nolet lived to the age of 65, never wandering far from this road, many of his family members were much more famous. Nolet's sister Bertha was easily one of the most accomplished in the family. She went back to the United States. I say back because that's where the family's ancestors had arrived in 1620, and she got her doctorate in medicine. She had actually hoped to travel overseas during World War I as a doctor, but instead had to go as a nurse because female doctors were not accepted in the war effort. Bertha is widely regarded as the first person to use physiotherapy on wounded soldiers. Now, when she returned to the States, female doctors were still not widely accepted, so she went into acting and became the first to recite the Bible, the first to offer a children's program, the first to offer readings with music in the background, and the first to broadcast a Shakespearean play, all on a new medium called radio. You'll notice that this area looks quite a bit different in terms of the trees and so forth than it did at the very beginning of this hike. At the beginning, there was land protected by the Nova Scotia Nature Trust and the provincial government as a nature reserve. Here, this land on either side of the road is privately held. There is a lot of information about the Beckwith lineage in this area. Records of marriages on this road, then called the Lightfoot Road, going back over 150 years. There are records in the community register of lambs on the first day of March in 1904, measles in June of 1899, and the redcoats assembling at nearby Aldershot in September of 1899. Well, I'm nearing the end of the abandoned portion of the knoll at Beckwith Road. It then becomes a maintained public road that continues all the way down to Shore Road and the Bay of Fundy. And that's actually where Noel at Beckwith lived with his father. His father passed away in 1905, and he lived there until then. That was just a year after Teresa Robinson was murdered, just a little ways up this road. Well, after the break, I'll be headed to yet another abandoned road, and that one also involves ghosts.
Won't you be mine? Feel the sunshine.
You know, the 1800s in Nova Scotia was a time of road building mania, if you will. Roads were being cut in just about every direction as people wanted the shortest route to get to different communities. At that time, they were traveling by horse-drawn carriage. It was in the 1930s and 1940s that the horseless carriage came along, the automobile, that spelled the death for many of those local routes. And of course, as new and improved highways got built, more and more routes became abandoned, though many of them remained legally highways. Like this one in East Tremont near Greenwood. This is the East Torbrook Road, and right around this spot, it becomes officially an abandoned road. This area was once called by the general name Nicktow, which comes from the Old English brook coming out of a hill. It was a literal name for the area given by European settlers living here at a town meeting on June 11, 1856. Now Nicktow is limited to an area east of Middleton, not far from here, and the communities around took on their own names. In this area, names like Torbrook and Tremont. I alluded to ghost stories associated with the area down at Lightfoot Road. This road takes you to a ghost town of sorts. What little remains of Conkerell, which at one time was a thriving community, but was also among the first in Kings County to be abandoned. Conkerell was a small, but by all accounts, very successful logging community, but it was short-lived. In 1900, it was supposedly bustling, but 20 years later in 1920, not a single family remained. The settlement likely started small and a bit earlier, reaching its boom in 1900. Maps suggest a town from around 1870. A town which at one time had a school with 32 students was gone by 1920. It's reported that the logging community was started by a man named Charles Gates from Aylesford. Whether that is accurate is hard to determine with any certainty, but at some point, a man with the last name Craven operated a very large orchard in the area, growing apples, plums, pears, and grapes. He also operated a sawmill near Crystal Falls, which was one of 12 mills in this area, producing everything from lumber to shingles. With 12 mills operating, plus orchards, it would have had to have been a very sizable community. A couple kilometers that way would take me to Crystal Falls, which was the site of the spinning mill. And a little bit further along, you'd find the former site of the Enos Hat Mill at Gracie Brook. Now, these days, this road is called the David Morse Trail, and you generally access it from the other end and use it to get to Crystal Falls. But back in the days when Conkerell was a thriving town, this was called the Spinning Mill Road. More than likely, this is what remains of the Happy Home Road. Now, in 1927, that would have taken you to the SS Stevens Mill. There was another Stevens Mill further up this road, but it's not clear whether they operated at the same time. But during the time when Conkerell was thriving up to 1920, there would have been a number of homesteads and likely businesses along this road. This is a public road, And while not maintained, it's no surprise that almost all of the land on the sides of the road is private. If you search property records, you'll find deeds going back to the time of Conkerel, when it was still a busy and prosperous place. The properties range in size from a few acres with values of $5,000 or $6,000 to a 3,000 acre parcel near the end of this road, valued at over $30 million. On my right, there's a property which shows it has been registered at least back to 1924, which has gone up for sale only a few weeks before I arrived here. It's 120 acres of mixed forestry land replanted 30 years ago. The asking price? $120,000, or $1,000 an acre. Forestry is still important here. Well, if I was to continue down that road, I would reach the site of what was yet another mill, the Moore Mill. Now, it's not clear whether that would have been the original road or whether these roads have been shifted over the last century or so with forestry operations. And on either side of this would have been a thriving town with homesteads and businesses. This is all that remains of Conkerel. The last house here is said to have been moved to Auburn, also in Kings County. Buried within what is now forest, you can sometimes find the foundations of homes that once existed. Abandoned, much like the province considers this and so many other roads which now provide interesting hiking opportunities. Finding and identifying abandoned roads has become a bit easier lately, thanks to Steve Scaff, who has been mapping them and maintains a Facebook page to help people find them so they can go exploring. He's also published a few books with pictures of the routes. You know, abandoned roads remind us of history that we should not abandon ourselves. Like the murder of Teresa Robinson, that reminds us we should not forget about domestic abuse. The pioneering success of Bertha Delight Beckwith, who conquered New York on behalf of all Nova Scotians. The men and women who farmed on the Canaan Mountain Road before it was bisected by a highway in the 60s. And of course here, East Torbrook Road and Conkerel, a community that is remembered by nothing but trees and ghosts. Martin Luther King Jr. once said that we are not makers of history, we are made by history. Well, I hope on your next walkabout, you discover something about some abandoned history of your own.
Hey, come on, feel the sunshine. Oh, come on, won't you be mine? Hey, come on, feel the sunshine. Oh, come on, won't you be mine? Oh, hey, oh, hey, feel the sunshine. Oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, feel the sunshine. Hey, come on, feel the sunshine.